Hello and welcome back to another episode of the podcast Little Girls Aren't Taught This. This week I have another guest episode and I am joined by the amazing Lucy Spicer. So Lucy is a certified psychological coach and she helps people become the best version of themselves by mastering their mind. She really specialises in helping high-performing women. So in this episode, it felt perfect to talk about perfectionism, to talk about high-performing anxiety, and just to talk about how as women we can set these really unrealistic goals and the impact that can have on us, and the impact of perfectionism, how it really intertwines itself into all of these aspects of our lives and causes so much pressure and so much anxiety. And we discuss what's on the other side of wanting to be a high performing woman and wanting to be a perfectionist and all of these really amazing things that it brings, like success. But we talk a little bit about the imposter syndrome and how we can internalize the stress of that and the pressure, and just really talk through some coping mechanisms and some ways that you can start to overcome perfectionism and high performing anxiety. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Let's dive right in. So hello, Lucy. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being on it. I would love you to just give the listeners a little introduction to who you are and what you do.
So I'm an accredited psychological coach and I work with women and I empower them. I guess my tagline probably is to master their mind. So what I mean by that is to really understand their mind, understand their thoughts, their triggers, how the mind works, so then they can create the change that they wish to see in their life. So that's what I would say was sort of my main tagline and my mission for helping women. And through that, I do it in one-to-one support, but I also host events around London, and I've been doing this now for 4 years, and I absolutely love it. So that is what I'm doing now. Obviously, my background was in the NHS and I worked in specialist hospitals before. So I started off working in a cancer hospital for 3.5 years, predominantly with children, but also adults, delivering therapy and doing neurocognitive assessments. I then left that hospital, went to Guy's and St Thomas's and worked in neurosciences. So worked with a lot of ADHD and autism and neurodevelopmental disorders. And then I came to a kind of crossroads at my life, which I have with a lot of my clients. And I kind of questioned, what is it that I want to do? Do I want to work for someone forever? And I don't think I was built to work for someone. I think I was always meant to have my own business. My dad's had his own business since he did his apprenticeship after he did his apprenticeship at 16. And I was in a rut, in a space where I'd moved back home. Things felt like they were falling apart. And I questioned everything, thought about what it is that I wanted to do. What did I want to take away from the way that I've been supporting people already in the NHS? But how did I want to do it in my way? So I did my coaching qualification, and I actually think if I went on my phone, I'll be able to tell you it was 4 years, almost this date that I had my last day in the NHS. And I left with just one client signed up who I was seeing from back in my childhood home on Zoom. And then the rest has been history. So 4 years later, we're still here.
I love that. And I actually love, if there's one thing I can say about from following you on Instagram, like your branding, the way that you, just the feel that you give from, and I know this might sound really bizarre to say, but I think in the type of work that we do, where we're practitioners in the online space, like our brand gives a feeling, gives the vibe, and we want to attract that to clients, and you just do that so well. And the things that you talk about resonate, and this is what I wanted to get you on the episode to talk about, is perfectionism, high performing anxiety, and just to kind of have a conversation between I gather you're a high performing woman by what I see, what I know about you, what I've read, and just to talk about that, because that brings a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it brings a lot of stuff, and it's something that I support a lot of my clients with, and I'm sure you can recognize it in yourself, Lydia, as well.
Yes.
I think it is rife, and it's really interesting you say that about my branding. I mean, everything is tailorized, right, to the sort of clients that I connect with, who show up. It's why my events are done in a certain way. Like, everything is curated, so I'm attracting those clients that I know I can help, and those clients tend to have experience perfectionism, experience imposter syndrome, and have kind of high functioning anxiety, would be how I would describe that. And so, with those clients, I always find them really interesting, because I think if we brought them into this session and wrote out, what life looked like on paper, you'd probably go, wow, that is amazing. They've achieved so much. But their internal world is a very different space to be. And I think that can be a real trouble with that kind of that sort of highly functioning anxiety, because people probably think that you're a coper, and they're probably not the sort of person that you're going to reach out to or think needs support. But actually, as I said, the way that their mind works, the way that this anxiety is manifesting for them, they come to me just really wanting the tools and strategies to be able to help them with that and what they're experiencing.
So can we talk a little bit about perfectionism and high performance anxiety, and just tell us a little bit more about those two things? Like, how might that impact an individual in their day-to-day life?
So I think it can impact, obviously, in lots of different ways, and I think it's always different for each individual. But kind of typical common thinking styles we might see is overthinking. So kind of going over and over and over the same thought and spiraling with that, maybe starting with a thought and a worry and micro analyzing that, and then spiraling into kind of thinking about those worst case scenarios happening. So let's say if we just put it into a work context, going for an interview, typically my clients probably be overqualified for the interviews that they're going to, and they would really fixate on all the things that really could go wrong. And it's not even just like wrong, it's like terrible. It's not even, they really jump to that worst case scenario thought. With that as well, then there's that pressure that they need to constantly excel in all areas of life. So they really need to be on the top of their game. Otherwise, again, they perceive their self as a failure. And when we're thinking of like perceiving yourself as a failure, that tends to mean that they have a highly critical voice, right? So that inner critic, that negative self-talk, that tends to be very loud in my clients, because they're always analyzing themselves and how they're doing. But with that, it's for them to then be able to perform at a really high, often unattainable level. Other features, I keep just reeling them off, so that maybe your listeners might be able to identify with them or not.
I think it's good to talk about the different ways, because I think actually there's so many ways that it would show up. And also, one of the things I wondered is, I wonder how that shows up for middle class women compared to like lower class women. So you were saying before, when, a lot of your clients, and from your own experience of being a middle class white woman, when we were talking before I pressed record, like, I wonder how these tendencies, like this perfectionism and this high performance anxiety, I wonder how that shows up in different, like, almost brackets. Have you had any experience of dealing with clients from different classes?
I think with the way that my business is set up at the moment, I tend to attract or have clients that are like me, are middle class, are professionals, have had a certain background. But I think it's a really interesting question and something to kind of look into and see, how are those presentations showing up differently. Obviously, I'm biased in that I'm reporting what I typically see with the clients that I've worked with. So I think it's a great question, Lydia, and something that actually, there should be more research into that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder, just from my experience of probably being from Liverpool, coming from like a working class background, I think if I just bring my own experience into it, so some of those anxieties from like middle class I relate to, but then I also relate to this, or I also think there's this other part where being a high performing woman means that maybe you're doing things that have not been seen in your family before. I was the first to go to university. I was the one who was doing things differently, like starting a business and just doing all of these different things. And I feel like that's a different layer that comes into it from like my working class background, because I had no evidence of that. So
Mm,
this anxiety, this imposter syndrome in some way was very loud for me because no one else around me had done it.
mm,
So there was
mm.
no belief there. So again, that's just very interesting. And I was thinking about, as you were talking, I was thinking about all of the different types of women that might listen to that. And I know we're both professionals, but our backgrounds are so different. Um, but yeah, what does that bring up for you?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I guess with my clients, when I think of their sort of conditioning and what they've been brought up with, there tends to be that pressure of them to follow certain expectations and guidelines, right?
Yeah.
So what you're saying, which is slightly different to that, is actually you sort of paved the way. You carved out a different route to yourself. And so
Mm,
that I wonder, Lydia, does that come with its own pressures for
yeah.
yourself? Yeah, yeah. So there's a differentiation there, but it's that same underlying pressure, right, that you're putting on yourself.
Mm,
And what we want to be looking at is that like a positive kind of cheerleady kind of pressure that you're putting yourself on, or is it coming more from a critical space, like I can't fail?
mm,
And
yeah.
that's when that inner critical voice tends to get loud and tends to get into the way and tends to fuel that anxiety, if that makes sense.
Mm. So in terms of high performing anxiety, how else might you see that show up in your day-to-day life for your clients?
There's again, if we're kind of bringing the imposter syndrome with that as well, it's like that fear of being found out, fear that
Oh,
you're
right.
not good enough, or you're a fraud for getting where you are, like you don't deserve the role that you've got. Or often it's interesting as well with clients, like if they do achieve something, there'll be a but. They tend to excuse it away. They find it difficult to kind of like sit in that space of celebrating themselves or their achievements. It feels too uncomfortable. Uh,
Mm.
and then I guess we need to think, whilst that's like more of the common thinking styles, how does that show up physiologically as well? Because we know that the mind and the body is connected. So physiologically, you might see that high performing anxiety come out as muscle tension, difficulties with your stomach, difficulty sleeping, headaches, maybe even panic attacks are showing up. So it's all going to be, it's all going to be different for everyone, but it's kind of a manifestation of anxiety, it just in a certain style or way. And I'm absolutely not diagnosing, by the way, from this list. It's just giving an idea of how it might show up and whether your audience resonates with that or not.
That honestly seems exhausting.
Yeah.
Like it would be to carry around that level of, I guess, just it feels like constant critique.
Yeah, that's exactly how it is.
And for you, why might somebody have that? Like have that perfectionism? Like in your work, do you ever look back to where that could stem from? Or if people are listening to this and they resonate with what we're talking about, is there any specific experiences that you see in your clients?
Mm-hmm. So I think you have to gain awareness, right, before you can make change. That's always my understanding. And the way that I tend to describe it to the clients that I work with is that imagine like the earth.
Yeah.
And on the surface of the earth, you kind of see these symptoms. So, like these certain thinking styles that I've described, or maybe some stomach problems, like when you're going to work in the morning or showing up in a meeting or whatever it might be. So, that's kind of like showing on the surface. What I'm always interested in is like, how can we dig to the core of the earth to kind of uncover what are those core beliefs that are kind of creating those symptoms on the surface. So are there core beliefs from like a fear of failure? Are there core beliefs of a fear of rejection? And then we would always want to get really curious around that. Where has that come from? Can you think of anything in childhood that maybe you can attribute that to? And then what has kept that going? So that would always kind of be my quite a basic formulation with the client. It's all, as I said before, it's always different to the individual. a lot of it I see at schooling. It would be
Okay.
the conditioning from school that they're kind of the gifted child, and that would then be reinforced by parents, mass celebration for their academic achievements, a real focus on that and not much else. And so then as a child, when you're forming that belief, you're like, I'm only worthy if I do well. Right? And that's formed at a young age, and that then follows you. But what I've seen as well is and again, this is quite niche, but like at school, you might have been the top of your class, but then you get into the big wide world, right? And then you go into, say you went to university. So I've heard this with Oxbridge students, for example, that at school, they've always been the top gifted child. They go to Oxbridge, suddenly that's not the case. They're at Oxford and Cambridge, and they are insanely gifted and talented at what they do, but they're in this space now where they're not the best. And that creates almost like an existential crisis. Who am I? What is my worth? Creates lots of anxiety, lots of low mood, lots of problems with self-esteem, because they've been always conditioned to believe that their worth is based on their success and how well they do. So I think it can always, as I said, we'd always think of each case individually, but it's always interesting when you go backwards to see what could have contributed to this belief and what's creating this drive for you to always seek perfection, to always do your best, and for there to be absolutely no room for error or failure.
What's the impact and gain for these women? So you were saying before, if you looked at their life on paper, you'd go like, oh my God. But when you're talking now, I'm just like, I feel exhausted just listening to how it must be. And I don't know if a part of that is just even pulling on my own experience of university and studying and building a business and almost like hustling to get to where you want to be. The level of pressure that I've experienced doing those things, I can't imagine then everything else that you've just said being intertwined in that, and being in this top percentage of high performing children in school and then universities. It feels like it's a lot for a woman to carry every single day. But what's the impact and what's the gain? Is there an impact and is there a gain?
So when you're with the gain is like the benefits, that's how I'm kind of interpreting.
Exactly that.
They do well, they have successful businesses, they've got to the top of the firms that they worked at, they've got their dream house, they've got all these things that they hope to achieve. That would be kind of their external. The impact, as we've described, is kind of this constant negative self-talk, this emotional turmoil, but also this disconnect. And that comes up a lot with the clients when I first meet them, is they feel so disconnected. They can be like, I've got these things, or I move around life and I just can't connect with those feelings of happiness or joy or gratitude, or even connecting with their kind of their body and their mind, being able to recognize emotion. So as well as that, obviously will be burnout, is they push themselves to the absolute max and they hustle, and there's burnout around as well. And so the manifestation of the anxiety, it's a really difficult thing to hold, but as I said, externally their life might look what we would deem perfect, but at what cost?
Yeah What is for people listening, what is burnout? Because I think that's actually something that you see a lot in the online space. So if you could explain that, and what the symptoms are that you're heading towards that, and what that would mean physically. I think that would be really beneficial.
I haven't got a formal diagnosis on me or a formal way of summarizing burnout, but from my interpretation of it, it'd be when you've pushed yourself beyond your limit for a really long time. Your nervous system is probably completely dysregulated. You are stuck in fight, flight, freeze, and you are experiencing difficulties then with your health, with extreme tiredness, maybe lots of illness. It's really pushing yourself to that max in an unsustainable way. And when you set these levels of or these standards for yourself, and you're constantly seeking to strive to meet those standards over a long period of time and not responding to your mental health in any sort of way, or your physical health, you're putting yourself at risk of that.
Is that something you experienced?
Pardon? Myself?
Yeah.
I was signed off work for 3 months in the NHS.
Wow.
Yeah, I was. Yeah, I haven't shared that much. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
I wondered what you saying, the type of job that you done previously, if that almost was a part of the journey for you, experiencing that.
Yeah,
Um,
it possibly was, Lydia. And that gave me the space to reflect. I would have had difficulty to create that space to reflect, to think about what it is that I really wanted and what it was that was important to me. I was commuting from Brighton to London every single day. On top of that, I was pushing myself to exercise every day. Not now, where I found my exercise absolutely Pilates, love it. I was doing high intensity, throwing my body everywhere, throwing weights everywhere, trying to socialize on top of that, trying to navigate a difficult part of my life at that time. And I gave myself no break. I pushed myself to the max, and that was the consequence.
mm,
The beauty from that and the gratitude from that was that I had that time to reflect. And I think that's what COVID brought us as well, as we then had time. And that's
yeah.
when, my business was really built during that time, because people were starting to reflect and think what was working for them and what wasn't. But mine was at the consequence of pushing myself to that limit.
Is there anything that when you reflect on that time helped you? So if there's anyone listening, is there any techniques or any tools that helped you start to rebuild that connection with yourself?
Yeah, slowing down.
Easier said than done.
That was a goodie. Slowing down. I took on a coach at that time, actually, to help me figure out my next steps. But getting back in touch with myself, actually reducing those limits on myself. I took a break from exercise for quite a while, just because I had pushed myself with exercise. It was important to me for my 20s, but I really need to reassess that relationship. So I took a space from that, and then build it up in a much more healthy, sustainable way. Now, as I said, I love my Pilates, I love my lower impact. It's a vibe, it works for me. So I think just taking that space, I think the most important question to ask yourself and to reflect is, what's not working? What's not working for me right now? What do I need? So having that self-inquiry, what do I need? What do I need more of? And how can I make space for that? So I do that a lot with my clients. And sometimes as their coach, that can be difficult, because especially with the professionals, so I work with professionals, work with entrepreneurs, work with female founders, but especially with the professionals, their working days is a long day. So I can't be like, I'd love to be like, right, meditate, journal, do your exercising, do your cold water therapy, do all these things that are going to help you. It's not sustainable. And I'm also setting themselves up for failure, because they have very limited time available to themselves. So I really think, what is it that they're probably not getting enough of? Sleep, rest, downtime, and then think about how we can then carve that into their everyday. So to go right back to the beginning and answer your question, if you're listening to this, have a real think to yourself, what's not working in my life? What do I need more of? If I'm running at 10% low battery mode on my iPhone, what do I need to charge myself up to 100%? And start to slowly implement those things in your life.
I like that. And I like also what you said around the journal and meditating, all of those different things, because actually it's not sustainable. And I think when you're an entrepreneur, especially, or you're building a business, there are going to be mornings, probably just pulling off my own experience here, but there are going to be mornings and days where you actually don't have the time and space. Like, as much as you want to keep those boundaries and keep those lovely morning routines in place where you do like an hour of all of the things, sometimes you want extra sleep. Like, you don't want to wake up early, and it's finding that balance. I think sometimes, like, I've struggled with that, and I think it's really refreshing to hear you say that you don't give clients things like that. You actually find solutions that fit into their lives, because I know I've had clients that have come to me, not the same type of clients, but even just that thing of, I'm implementing everything I should be and it's not working.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you unpack that and I'm like, well, that's kind of why it's not working, because it doesn't feel like it's fitting into your life.
Yeah. Exactly. So I don't do anything prescriptive with my clients. I don't repeat anything for the same client. I work them out. I work out what their interests and their strategies will all vary. So I have clients whose releases pole dancing as movement. I have another client who goes open water swimming. I have another client who ice baths have really worked. I have another client who says breath work has like transformed her life. So all of my clients are doing slightly different things because we're all built so differently. So how can the same strategies help everyone? And I think as soon as you're sitting into like, I should be doing this, I must do this, icky, you know, we want to really think about what's motivating for you, what do you want to do, and what feels good for you to do.
Yeah. Why is it so hard for us to rest, especially as women?
Because we're in this culture now, we're in this westernized world that's very target driven and competitive, and think of us as women, we're always being put, thank you patriarchy, into competition with one another, and we're trying to fit into a patriarchal world, you know, the 9 to 5, we're cyclical.
Yeah.
They hustle, they wake up with a burst of testosterone, we don't, and we push ourselves to the max. And I think now I feel like there's like more of an awakening and an understanding of kind of our energy and how we need to slow down, and actually rest is productive, and to be much more intuitive and much more in tune with ourselves and our body and what we need. Especially, you know, if we have a cycle, if we're menstruating, we're not going to be the same when we're bleeding as we're ovulating, you know, a basic comparison. We're just trying to learn to work with ourselves. But I think there is just this pressure, we obviously see it all over social media, which has changed the game, I think, in so many ways, to hustle, to push. You can only do that so much.
Yeah. I actually, on the back of the last couple of years that I've had with like studying and emigrating and then coming back and all of these different things, I started getting some like really, I wonder if it was like a burnout thing actually. I've just kind of had that realization because I was getting a lot of physical symptoms where I just felt uneasy in my body, and I was like, I've never felt like this, but I just don't feel good. I can't put my finger on it. So I actually started going to a body worker. And on the first session, she was like feeling into the body, and she just said to me, "You are full of cortisol." She said, "Your whole body is just, your fascia is just in protective mode." And that hit me hard. And I was like, right, I need to make the changes. Like I can't continue to hustle. Are you seeing more of this awareness slash compassion coming with your clients for cycle awareness and how we can't handle stress? And how are they finding juggling that? Because I imagine it would be somewhat triggering to that perfectionism, that anxiety, that loud inner critic.
Yeah. I think especially with compassion. So as part of my practice, I also have an incredible therapist called Rachel, who my clients go to as well. And she is a psychotherapist and a CBT therapist. She's absolutely amazing at what she does. And she's really about this compassion focused therapy movement and really pro it. And I love it. And I think it's so important that we respond to ourselves in that way for our mental health. But if you've come from a place of being very self-critical, that is so uncomfortable. Like one of my tasks sometimes with my clients who might get to a point is we'll think about doing things for themselves and prioritizing themselves and giving themselves permission to rest, or it's okay if they didn't get that one task done that day, and to try and speak to themselves in a kinder voice. And that can be a real challenge because they've spent years and years and years and years and years speaking to themselves in a certain way. Then we add another layer on top of it where we're trying to think a bit more flexibly around this perfectionism, and if there's any sort of grey, any sort of movement where things don't have to be 100% perfect, and setting them out to kind of test that. And then that feels deeply uncomfortable because there's a fear of failure. What if I do less? How can less be good, right? It would be a mindset. How can less be good? Surely more, and I hear this word all the time, productive. Need to be more productive. Have to be more productive. And it's just this push energy. So we get to that point, but like change, you know, I welcome discomfort, because if there's not discomfort, what are we changing?
Yeah.
You know, what are we changing? And I do it in a very graded, very warm, very gradual way. But we have to create that discomfort sometimes to get to that other side and to get to that place that they want to be, which is a much happier space in their internal world.
I actually feel like coming into this conversation that like a lot is coming up to do with the body for me. Like when you're talking, just thinking and reflecting on these women and how they must be and just how almost dysregulated they must be. So the layers of almost, not that it's simple to come away from the mindset of like perfectionism and imposter syndrome. It's absolutely not. But the layers of the body stuff that must come in for clients in terms of total dysregulation, stress, these symptoms, the uncomfortability. Feels like it's a big process for them to ease out of this high performing kind of like construct that they've been living in.
Absolutely. So I always do things in tandem. I always say to my clients, so I'm a meditation and breathwork teacher as well. And I think it's so important to get to a place where you've learned to soothe your nervous system, especially to then be able to do the work, right? The work.
Yeah.
We want to be acting from a place of calm, a place of balance, thinking from that space. And so I really help my clients in trying to equip them with the tools to be able to do that, because when we're in that fight or flight response, we've got adrenaline surging through our body, we've got cortisol surging through our body, our amygdala's going off being like, we're under threat, we're under threat, we're under threat. We can't get the clarity, we can't think clearly, we can't challenge those thoughts because our mind and our body is in protective mode. Actually, one of the first pieces of work is how can we soothe your nervous system to then be able to get to a place where we can do some of the challenging, take yourself out of your comfort zone, do things in a different way. I think that is so vital. You can't do the mind stuff without the body stuff.
Yeah. One of the things I very strongly realized in my own journey is that we can't just focus on the mind stuff. So when we think about perfectionism, it often drives people to set unrealistic high standards for themselves, which you've touched on. How can people strike that balance that you're talking about between striving for excellence but also coming back to the compassion and understanding kind of the consequences of perfectionism?
Yeah, so I think it's what I touched on now is how can we, I always think in the work that I do, like, what's the gray? So rather than thinking in that black and white, success or failure, what's the gray area? Where is, and what in that gray area, where is that space for change? So a gray area might be, for example, I can lower my efforts from like 100% to say 80%. So what that might look like, for example, I have clients that push themselves to work overtime, again, because of perfectionism, because of worries of letting people down, because of worries of not meeting their standards. So a task in our journey together might be, can you finish 15 minutes earlier? Then half an hour earlier? And we start to think, that gray area, rather than it always having to be all or nothing. With that as well, with that kind of gray area, it's that flexibility of thought. So we start to challenge those beliefs. If I don't get something 100% right, or if I don't know the answer in the meeting, does that really mean that I'm a total failure? Does that really mean that I'm awful at that job? So we just want to see some flexibility, Lydia, and think about, where's that space for change? And I sometimes do this grid with my clients of thinking like the advantages and disadvantages of staying the same and the advantages and disadvantages of change. It's like a common therapy tool, because some things they might want to keep. For example, it does mean that they're driving. It does mean that they're moving forwards. It does mean that, it's important for them and their success that they are, for example, detail focused, or they are always motivated to do more, to do better. But then we just need to think of that, okay, but where is the space where it's not serving you, and how can we work on that? Does that make sense? So it's not about taking away their drive and their ambition. That's not the goal here. It's that's still important to you, but how can we do that in the healthiest way possible? How can we develop your self-awareness so that you're doing that in a sustainable way, not this hustle, burnout, self-critical way?
Yeah, that feels like a nice space to almost come into. So you still have that element that wants to achieve and do all of these amazing things, but it almost just feels like those check-ins with self and almost those self boundaries that come in of, okay, I can allow myself to finish 15 minutes earlier, which I imagine for your clients that sounds easy,
That's
but
wild.
that would be very uncomfortable for them to do that. Um, how do these women, how do high performing women also manage families, being someone's girlfriend, their own health? It seems like a lot. Like we're only touching on one area. And does perfectionism, imposter syndrome, that desire to want to get it perfect, I imagine that doesn't just show up in business.
Spills out into all areas.
Everything.
Yeah, so often a client will come to me and they'll be like, how can I be a good mum? How can I be really good at my job? How can I be a good wife? How can I maintain good friendships? So it spills into all areas. And like, you know, if we just touched on the work side of things, now imagining putting that into the areas. So the friend that's always showing up, a really good wife, a mum who's always present there for her child. And then you're trying to kind of juggle all those areas with your 100% effort. It's not, yeah. It doesn't work. So again, we go back to the same thing that I would say, individual difference, always different for everyone. But yes, I do see it, and it would be common that it's not just in one area, it spills out into other areas.
Is it harder to spot in mothers because is there a part of them that wants to give 100% for their children? So that does that feel harder to find the grey?
That's interesting. When I've done this work with mum, so actually my background in the NHS was mainly in pediatrics, so with children, and when you're doing therapy with children, you're often doing therapy with the parents as well. So I would say in my experience, it's almost that compassion piece of work that's come in. And, you know, not as a mum, and I haven't experienced that for myself, but as a mum, you know, mum guilt is really common, right?
Yeah.
That you're not doing enough, that you should be doing more, which is probably a manifestation of this like perfectionism and always having to succeed and there being no room with error. So I think, you know, that it would be a harder area to, or a different area to work on. But again, we would be looking for that flexibility. You know, it's okay if you miss something. It's okay if you weren't that present when you were playing with your child. You know, it's okay if you had to go and do that work thing and they had to be looked after by someone else, even if it was your day with them. And just, again, building your client up to just have a much more compassionate relationship with themselves, and that leaving space that actually they're not going to get everything perfect 100% of the time. None of us will. And that's okay. That doesn't make them a bad person.
No. Touching on imposter syndrome a little bit again, we've spoken about, you know, how it can hold people back from embracing accomplishments. So what strategies have you suggested for clients to help them recognize and overcome imposter syndrome, both in personal and professional contexts?
So with my work, I like to do the inner critic, and I guess the imposter syndrome is an extension of an inner critic because it's coming from a critical place. So I love doing externalization. So I love turning things into characters. So bear with me. So, for example, with clients who have, if we're working with their anxiety, they might have like a worry wasp or a mosquito. With imposter syndrome, we turn that into something else. So for one of my clients, that's a character from the Devil's Web. I can't get this out. Devil. Oh my God, Devil Wears Prada.
Devil Wears Prada.
There we go. We're in. So they've got her. Another one has got like an extension of her as her name, but it's this different version of her. And for me, my imposter syndrome is Penelope the perfectionist. So when you externalize it, when you've got to know that imposter syndrome, so the sort of things that it makes you believe about yourself would be an important question to ask. Where it is the most, so when it shows up the most, your imposter syndrome. So is that going into meetings? Like Penelope was wild before this podcast, but I know she's going to be there. So it doesn't take me by surprise. I'm like, oh yeah, here comes Penelope, you know, telling me that I might mess something up. I might not answer the question correctly. And because I have that real awareness of her and I have that detachment from her, because she's now a thing, she's now a character. Someone's just strong on me. I go, okay, cool, Penelope's here, see you later. I'm going for it. So it's a similar sort of strategy that I teach with my clients, is through this process of externalization, which come from narrative therapy. Can we make a character out of this, so then you have control over that imposter syndrome? You can then weaken its voice. Then on top of that, it's really helping you, or helping the client, to build their confidence so that they can become their own cheerleader. So I do that in different ways. So one way is, me and my clients are in contact most days on an app I use called Voxer. They'll send me daily wins. So again, trying to encourage them to look for the good within the day. Another strategy I do is to get them to build a document called Love Notes, which I again did for myself as soon as I started coaching. Any testimonial, any DM, any bit of positive feedback, I collected on a sheet called Love Notes. I think it's on to like 50 or 60 pages now. And I typed up every single thing that was said to me. So then when I have my moments of wobble, like when Vogue India asked me to write for them, or when I've been on certain podcasts or whatever, or my own event, and I'm like, and Penelope's around, I look on my Love Notes. My mind loves it because it's a whole list of positive evidence that actually I can do this. And it gives me that motivation, and it squashes that imposter syndrome. So I think collating positive evidence in that way is great, because typically with imposter syndrome, you're always going to be searching and looking for the negative.
Yeah.
And then gratitude, being grateful for yourself and what you've achieved, and celebrating that success for yourself and how you've got this far, not always focusing on what's next, being able to ground yourself in what you're grateful for right now, and maybe some of the things that you wish for when you were younger. So again, like recognizing your achievements, being able to sit down in that. So there's lots of different strategies that you can use, but I think really powerful ones, if I was just plucking them from the top of my head, would create distance from that imposter syndrome, create a character out of it. And then when it shows up, you're going to know it's going to be there. Say, see you later, laugh at it, create that weakness because you're in control. And then on top of that, really take positive steps to look for the good. Look for the good within yourself. Look for micro wins, small wins. And then you start to rewire the brain to look for the good over the negative and how you're not doing enough.
I love that. And I love that seeing your inner critic as a character. I actually done that with one of my clients.
Have you?
She chose the name Barbara. And actually what I found in session is that when we speak about it, we speak about it in a third person.
Yes.
So we speak about Barbara like she's a separate entity, and it really helped create that detachment. And it's funny because there was an incident that came up and she was like, oh, and then Barbara made an appearance, and I was just like, you've just said, and here she is.
Yes.
It's almost like a really like we laugh as we talk about these characters, but it's a fun way to just lighten something that can be quite heavy for people.
Absolutely. And obviously with my background in kids, I had to be super creative, and that's where it came from. So when I was seeing children in the hospital, we had actual worry monsters, like they were actual teddies, and they and they had a zipped mouth. And so we encouraged the children and their family to write down their worries, and they'd feed it to the worry monster, and then the worry monster would gobble that up for them, because for children it's really difficult for them to articulate their feelings. That's what's been easier working with adults, as they can access that information. But as soon as you talk about it as the worry monster or the worry, it really helps them to then be able to think about that and to be able to express kind of the worries that have been around for them. So that's literally where I took it from and put it into another space. But I love being creative. I draw things for my clients. They'll know I've got my journal here. All my clients get their own journal as well. I draw models, I draw pictures. It's stickmen at this point. But if they're creative and that's the way that they think, that can be really, really powerful.
Yeah. I also resonate with that. Obviously, my training was in creative therapies, and I remember thinking about bringing that into my private practice, and a lot of my clients were like, no, I don't want to be creative. Well, okay. And then obviously as time develops, you really get into like a rhythm, don't you, with how you are as a practitioner. And now I just like have my creative bits out often in space, or I'll give it as an offering, and clients will do it. And there's this real special thing about seeing a grown woman being creative in session and exploring with creativity and fun, and it really feels like a moment of it, where she brings her inner child in.
So yeah.
And some of the simple creative things that we have done, even so simple as like doodling, and they've been like, I can't believe how much that's helped me process.
Yeah.
It's amazing, the power of creativity.
Yeah, and I think as soon as you've unlocked that for a client and they work in that certain way, that's amazing, and just being able to tailor your approach to the client, how they think, how they work, what's motivating for them is so important, rather than just, always sitting in kind of that traditional talking therapy, which won't work for certain clients. I work with clients with ADHD, for example, so I have to tailorize my approach completely to suit their needs. I think being able to be flexible like that is so important.
So the last thing I want to ask you about is social media and how this plays in. You touched on it slightly before, but how does social media play into all of these things that we've spoken about?
It exacerbates it, Olivia. Shock horror. Because you're worried about these things, and then you are thinking that you're not enough, and then you can open your social media when you wake up at 7 a.m. and then you can fall straight into comparison, and it only embeds that belief even further. So social media will come up a lot in my client sessions, because if you are vulnerable to comparison, which of course, if you're experiencing things like perfectionism and high performing anxiety and imposter syndrome, is all rooted in a comparison and not feeling as good as others. And when you go onto social media and you go onto social media with that lens, with that bias, all you're going to see is people doing, and I'm doing quotation marks, better than you. And then if you do, with a lot of my clients do, am I perfect? No. So obviously sometimes I do as well, scroll when I wake up first thing in the morning. That is then how you've set your tone off for the day. You've activated those subconscious beliefs, you've activated that anxiety for yourself that other people are out and have already run 10K or whatever on this holiday that you can't afford, if that's important to you, or whatever it is, and you can get stuck in a hole. So I think social media can be incredible. Obviously, I'm so fortunate. My business was built on Instagram, which is a free platform, like amazing. But also we really need to be using it in a mindful way as well.
How do you find being a practitioner in the space? Because this is something I'm finding more. I know you are a coach, but kind of like how different traditional like coaching content is compared to maybe the content I see you put out, or the content I'm starting to shift into. I spoke to someone else recently. She was from America and she was a clinical psychologist, and she was saying she doesn't put like that quick, fast, kind of like sexy content out to get people in. She's like, I really have to think about what I put out, and I put it out with the with the intention to be informative for my clients and like be that safe space. Do you feel like that plays into anything to do with like followers or interaction, or maybe certain content that you put out? Does that come up for you? Because I've noticed as I transition, it comes up a little bit for me.
I think social media, in terms of my relationship and with business, you have to be really careful with how you use it. And again, we were speaking at the beginning of this, and that how we resonate with perfectionism and comparison. And when you're using Instagram as your marketing platform, of course, it's so easy to look at other people in the industry and compare yourself and think, should I be doing that? Should I be doing it their way? And get completely caught up in that noise. So I did this a while ago. I'm very selective in terms of who I follow, because I find that noise completely unhelpful. And it, especially in the early days, now I'm very cemented in kind of who I am, what I'm about, what my brand is, how I'm using my social media. It did fuel that anxiety and that fears of not being good enough, or maybe doing things in a way that wouldn't feel authentic. So I stay very authentic to myself. My social media is very carefully curated in terms of who I follow with other people in the space. And for me, I'm never going to be a coach who puts kind of clickbaity or triggering content out there. That's not my vibe. If anything, I should be, and I haven't got a coach, I haven't worked with a coach for a while, but if anything, I should be showing up 10 times more than I am on social media. But what's my priority in my zone of genius is working with my clients. So I might not be the most present coach on social media, but it's because I'm putting so much into my clients. So I tend to just put what works for me. I like to be consistent. So every Monday I do my Monday mantras, because I used to use them myself when I talked about that period, those 3 months, and kind of finding my inspiration and my spark. Friday wins in line with imposter syndrome. I do that every Friday. I share bits of my life because I think it's important for you to get a bit of a sense of me. And then in terms of the content, I will give tips and tricks, but it's of course so different to what a one-to-one client session would look like with me. This is surface level stuff. This is, and also, can I just preach from the high heavens? Instagram is not a replacement for therapy or coaching.
No.
Great. It's blooming great if it gives you insight and it sparks something and it helps you understand yourself better, but it will never, ever replicate the real thing.
No, that's so true. And also, when you said then around your zone of genius with your clients, I just find I'm less active on social media now because I'm just so present with clients and in the process for clients. And then outside of that, I'm just really trying to be present and enjoy my life and, bring rest into it. And I've noticed kind of like that pullback from social media. But in a way that feels really good because I'm just over here, like with my clients in the process, actually doing so much depth of work, like so much incredible work. Then I just like, oh yeah, shit, I need to go back onto social media and just like post. So I really resonate with that. But I think that's actually a nice transition. It feels really nice to be in that space as a practitioner in online. And something else that just come up that I just want to touch on because I feel like it's important given my audience is, how does this link to body image? That might seem like a really loaded question, but how do these topics link to body image for high performing women, body image with imposter syndrome, body image with perfectionism? Does it link? And if it does, how do you see it play out for clients?
I think it would link in a couple of ways. I think it would be, again, setting those standards for yourself, that you have to look in a certain way to be accepted or to be worthy or to be attractive, and then that pressure you're putting on yourself to attain that, and then actually that can then create kind of dysmorphia where you're not even able to acknowledge maybe the things that you do have, because you're always striving for more or something different. And when you've got social media then thrown into the mix and you're comparing yourself to all these other women and feeling like you're not enough, that's only going to weaken your self-esteem and how you see yourself. And I'd say again, Lydia, all very interlinked. It's often not just about the work, it's how you see yourself. It's perfectionism and this anxiety that we speak about and imposter syndrome, it all comes from low self-esteem, right? And not believing that you're worthy enough as you are.
Thank you so much. It's been such an interesting conversation. Just tell the listeners where they can find you and how they can work with you.
Sure. So you can find me on my Instagram at LucySpicer_. You can find me on my website, www.lucyspicer.com. As I said, I have a practice, so it's me and Rachel, and we can see you in a one-to-one format. As well as that, I have events in London. I'm planning another one towards the end of the year, and they have been so transformative for my clients. It's a great way to meet other like-minded women, as it can feel quite lonely in this space if you're into healing and self-development, but the other people around you aren't. So I put on events for that purpose, and I'm also launching my very own podcast very, very soon in the next couple of weeks.
Exciting.
Yes, and I haven't said that anyway. So so they're the main ways that you can find me. And of course, if anything's resonated with you or you want to find out more, please send me a DM or an email and I'll be happy to follow up with you.
Thank you so much. I'll put all the links in the show notes. Thank you so much. It's been such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Lydia. And I really look forward to speaking to you soon.